They thought Stephanie St. Clair had no muscle, until the room turned against them. Harlem, 1928. The smoke hung thick in the basement of the Cotton Club, curling around the faces of men who thought they owned the world. Dutch Schultz sat at the head of the table, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him like a shadow. His eyes scanned the room, calculating, always calculating. To his left sat representatives from the Luciano family. To his right, Irish mobsters from Hell's Kitchen. These were men who controlled the flow of illegal liquor, drugs and gambling throughout New York City. They were untouchable, or so they believed. The meeting had been called for one purpose: to divide up Harlem's numbers racket, the illegal lottery that generated millions of dollars annually from the pockets of working-class black residents. It was a lucrative operation, and these white gangsters wanted their cut. More than their cut, they wanted it all. "Gentlemen," Schultz began, his voice rough as gravel, "we've been patient. We've watched these colored operators run their little game long enough. It's time we take what's rightfully ours. The numbers racket in Harlem is worth a fortune, and we're leaving money on the table every day we wait." Nods around the table, glasses raised. These men had carved up the city before, dividing territories like generals mapping out conquered land. Harlem would be no different. It was just another neighborhood, another revenue stream, another group of people who wouldn't fight back because they couldn't fight back. "There's just one problem," spoke up Joey Noe, Schultz's right-hand man, Stephanie St. Clair. The name hung in the air like a bad joke. Several men chuckled. Stephanie St. Clair, a woman, a black woman from Martinique who ran numbers in Harlem. The absurdity of it almost made them laugh out loud. "The French dame?" Schultz leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at his lips. "What about her?" "She controls about 40% of the numbers operation in Harlem," Noe explained. "Her runners are loyal, her operation is tight, and word on the street is she won't negotiate." Schultz's smirk widened into a grin. "She won't have a choice. We'll make her an offer. If she refuses, we'll shut her down. Simple as that." What these men didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Stephanie St. Clair wasn't just another numbers runner. She was something they had never encountered before. A woman who understood power better than they did, who had built an empire not through brute force alone, but through intelligence, strategy, and an unshakable understanding of human nature. She was a woman who had survived poverty in the Caribbean, discrimination in America, and the brutal underworld of Harlem's criminal enterprises. She was, in every sense of the word, a queen. And queens don't bow to would-be conquerors. Born in Martinique in 1886, Stephanie St. Clair arrived in America in 1912 with $10 in her pocket and a determination forged in fire. The journey across the Atlantic had been brutal, packed into steerage with other immigrants seeking opportunity in the promised land of America. She spoke French and Creole but little English, yet she understood the universal language of survival. She had watched her mother work herself to death on the island, had seen how colonialism and poverty crushed dreams before they could take root. She vowed that her own story would be different. She settled in Harlem during the neighborhood's transformation, arriving just as the Great Migration was beginning to reshape the demographics of northern cities. Black Americans from the South were fleeing Jim Crow violence and economic oppression, seeking opportunity and dignity in cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit. Harlem became the epicenter of this transformation, changing from a white middle-class neighborhood into the cultural and spiritual capital of Black America during the Harlem Renaissance. St. Clair worked whatever job she could find at first: domestic service, factory work, anything that paid. She saved every penny, learned English by reading newspapers, and studied the dynamics of the neighborhood around her. She watched as jazz clubs opened, as writers and artists gathered in cafes, as the neighborhood pulsed with creative energy and ambition. While artists and intellectuals were creating a cultural revolution above ground, St. Clair was building an empire below it, in the shadows where money and power exchanged hands away from the eyes of the law. The numbers racket was simple in concept, but complex in execution. People would bet small amounts, sometimes as little as a penny or a nickel, on a three-digit number ranging from 000 to 999. The winning number was determined by various methods, usually derived from stock market figures or racetrack results, numbers that couldn't be manipulated by the operators. If your number matched the designated winning number, you won. The odds were long, 600 to 1, but the dream was powerful. For people living in poverty, working backbreaking jobs for minimal pay, scrubbing floors or hauling cargo for a few dollars a week, the numbers represented hope. A chance, however slim, at a better life. A way to pay off debts, to send a child to school, to buy a new dress or a decent meal. It was the poor person's stock market, their own version of American capitalism. St. Clair understood this on a fundamental level. She understood that she wasn't just running a gambling operation, she was selling dreams, yes, but she was also providing something deeper, a sense of possibility in a world that offered Black Americans very little. The mainstream economy was largely closed to them. Banks wouldn't give them loans. Employers wouldn't hire them for good jobs. The system was rigged against them in 1,000 visible and invisible ways. The numbers racket, for all its illegality, was one of the few economic systems in which they could participate on relatively equal terms. And she did it with integrity, something rare in the criminal underworld. She paid out winnings promptly and in full. She didn't cheat her customers. She didn't use violence unnecessarily. Her reputation for fairness made her operation the most trusted in Harlem, and trust translated into loyalty, which translated into money. By the late 1920s, Stephanie St. Clair was making more money than most legitimate businessmen in New York, pulling in thousands of dollars per week in an era when the average worker made $20 per week if they were lucky. She dressed impeccably in tailored suits and elegant dresses, wore furs and jewelry that sparkled under the streetlights, and drove expensive cars down boulevards where most people couldn't afford bus fare. She owned property throughout Harlem and employed dozens of runners who collected bets and distributed winnings across the neighborhood, creating jobs in a community that desperately needed them. She was known as Queenie, or Madame St. Clair, and when she walked down Lenox Avenue, people stepped aside with respect, not out of fear but out of genuine admiration for what she had accomplished against impossible odds. Her headquarters moved frequently for security reasons, but everyone in Harlem knew how to get a bet to Madame St. Clair. Her network of runners was legendary for its efficiency and reliability. Unlike other operators who might disappear when big payouts were due, St. Clair always paid. She understood that her reputation was her most valuable asset, worth more than any single day's profits. But respect from the community and respect from white gangsters were two very different things. And when Dutch Schultz decided he wanted Harlem's numbers racket, he assumed that taking it from a woman, even a successful one, would be easy. He was catastrophically wrong. The first approach came on a Tuesday afternoon. Two of Schultz's men walked into one of St. Clair's collection spots on 135th Street. They wore expensive suits and confident smiles, the kind of smiles men wear when they think they hold all the cards. "We're here to see Madame St. Clair," the taller one announced to the woman behind the counter. "She's not here," came the reply. "Then you'll give her a message. Tell her that Mr. Schultz would like to arrange a meeting. Tell her it's in her best interest to attend." The message was delivered. St. Clair's response was immediate and unambiguous. "Tell Mr. Schultz that I don't take meetings with men who send messengers instead of coming themselves. And tell him that my operation is not for sale." When Schultz heard this, he laughed. He actually laughed. The audacity of this woman amused him, but his amusement quickly turned to irritation and irritation to anger. Who did she think she was? Didn't she know who he was? Didn't she understand what happened to people who refused Dutch Schultz? The second approach was less polite. Schultz's men began intimidating St. Clair's runners, threatening them, roughing them up. They vandalized collection spots, scared away customers, and made it clear that anyone who continued working for Madame St. Clair would face consequences. Most criminal operators would have folded at this point. The smart move, the safe move, would have been to negotiate a partnership, give Schultz a percentage, and keep operating under his protection. That's what every other numbers banker in Harlem eventually did. They bent the knee because they valued survival over pride. But Stephanie St. Clair had never been interested in safe moves. She had crossed an ocean alone, built a fortune from nothing, and survived in a world that was hostile to both her race and her gender. She wasn't about to surrender her empire to a thug from the Bronx, no matter how fearsome his reputation. Instead of capitulating, she declared war. St. Clair understood something that Schultz and his associates didn't. Violence wasn't the only form of power, and sometimes it wasn't even the most effective form. She began by fortifying her operation. She hired former boxers and ex-soldiers as protection for her runners. She moved her collection spots frequently, making them harder to target. She increased payouts to her most loyal customers, ensuring their continued patronage despite the intimidation. But more importantly, she went on the offensive. St. Clair began gathering information on Schultz's operations. She documented his illegal activities in meticulous detail: dates, times, locations, names of corrupt police officers on his payroll, records of payoffs and protection money. She kept extensive files, and she let it be known that if anything happened to her, these files would be delivered directly to law enforcement officials who weren't on the mob's payroll. She also did something unexpected. She went public. St. Clair wrote letters to newspapers, gave interviews, and spoke openly about police corruption and the mob's attempts to take over Harlem's numbers racket. She positioned herself not as a criminal, but as a community defender, protecting black-owned businesses from white gangsters, and the community rallied behind her. This was the era of the Harlem Renaissance, a time of intense racial pride and cultural awakening. The idea of white gangsters trying to steal from the black community ignited anger and resistance. St. Clair became a folk hero, a symbol of defiance against oppression. People who had never met her defended her in the streets. Ministers mentioned her in sermons. She received support from community leaders, business owners, and ordinary residents who saw her fight as their fight. Schultz, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frustrated. Every move he made seemed to backfire. When his men attacked St. Clair's operations, community members fought back. When he tried to corrupt her runners, they remained loyal. When he attempted to use political pressure, she countered with public exposure. The woman who was supposed to be an easy target had become his most formidable opponent. The situation came to a head in 1931 during a meeting of New York's major crime figures. The location was a warehouse in Brooklyn, neutral territory, where the heads of various criminal organizations gathered to resolve disputes and divide territories. Schultz had called the meeting specifically to address the Harlem situation, confident that he could pressure the other crime bosses to support his takeover of St. Clair's operation. The room was filled with the most dangerous men in New York: Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and several other mob bosses who controlled everything from unions to politicians. These were men who had built empires through ruthlessness and violence. They had rules, codes, and an understanding that certain things were simply not done, but they also respected strength, and they despised weakness. Schultz presented his case. He talked about the money being made in Harlem's numbers racket, about how it should be under their control, about how this black woman was standing in the way of progress and profit. He expected support, a unified front that would crush St. Clair's resistance once and for all. But something unexpected happened. The room didn't turn the way Schultz anticipated. It turned, but not in his favor. Meyer Lansky, the brilliant criminal strategist, spoke first. "Dutch, you're telling us you can't handle one woman. You're asking for help because a woman is beating you." The mockery in his voice was unmistakable. Other men around the table smirked. Schultz's face reddened. "It's not about handling her," Schultz protested. "It's about coordinating our efforts, maximizing profits." "Sounds to me like you're losing," Lucky Luciano chimed in. "And losing badly. This woman, she's making you look like a fool. Every day you can't shut her down, you look weaker. And weakness is bad for all of us." The room murmured in agreement. In the underworld, reputation was everything. A gangster who couldn't control his territory, who couldn't enforce his will, was a liability. And Schultz, by his own admission, couldn't control Stephanie St. Clair. But it wasn't just mockery that Schultz faced. Several of the crime bosses had done their own research on St. Clair, and what they found impressed them. Here was a woman who ran a tight operation, who paid her debts, who kept meticulous records, and who had built genuine loyalty in her community. These were qualities they valued. Moreover, her public campaign against police corruption was actually helping them in unexpected ways, exposing corrupt cops who might flip on any criminal organization if the pressure got too high. Frank Costello, known for his political connections and strategic thinking, leaned forward. Maybe the problem isn't St. Clair. Maybe the problem is your approach, Dutch. This woman has something you can't get through force, the community's support. You go in there swinging and you make her a martyr. You make all of us look like we're at war with Harlem. That's bad for business. So what are you suggesting? Schultz demanded. We just let her operate? Let a woman dictate terms to us? I'm suggesting, Costello said slowly, that maybe this woman has earned her territory. She built it, she runs it well, and she's willing to fight for it. Those are qualities we respect in our own organizations. Why should we not respect them in hers? This was the moment when the room truly turned. One by one, the crime bosses made it clear that they would not support Schultz's war against St. Clair. Some saw her as a potential ally, someone who could help maintain peace in Harlem and keep operations running smoothly. Others simply didn't want to waste resources on a fight that was making them all look incompetent. And some perhaps felt a grudging admiration for a woman who refused to be intimidated by the most powerful criminals in America. Schultz left that meeting humiliated and furious. He had expected solidarity and received mockery. He had asked for support and been denied. The men he thought would back him had instead praised his enemy. The room had turned against him, and in the underworld, that was a dangerous position to be in. But Stephanie St. Clair's victory wasn't complete, and she knew it. Schultz was wounded but still dangerous, like a cornered animal, and wounded animals were the most vicious. Over the next few years, the conflict between St. Clair and Schultz continued, a brutal war of attrition that saw violence on both sides. St. Clair survived multiple assassination attempts. Her operations were raided repeatedly by police on Schultz's payroll. The fight took its toll on her financially and emotionally. In 1935, St. Clair was arrested on charges related to her numbers operation. She spent time in prison, and when she emerged, the landscape had changed. Schultz had gained more ground in Harlem, bringing in partners and using increased violence to force cooperation. But even from prison, St. Clair remained defiant, continuing to gather evidence against corrupt officials and mob operations. Then, in October of 1935, something remarkable happened. Dutch Schultz was assassinated, killed on orders from the mob bosses who had once sat in meetings with him, men who decided that his recklessness and volatility made him too dangerous to keep alive. When St. Clair heard the news, she reportedly sent a telegram to his hospital bed before he died. It read, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." With Schultz gone, St. Clair's position improved, but the numbers racket itself was changing. The Italian mob consolidated control over much of Harlem's gambling operations, and St. Clair eventually stepped back from day-to-day operations. But she never fully surrendered, never fully capitulated, and never stopped fighting for her community. She spent her later years as an activist and advocate, fighting against police brutality and corruption, speaking out for civil rights long before the civil rights movement gained national prominence. She used her knowledge of the underworld to expose corruption, writing letters to newspapers and politicians, documenting abuses, and demanding accountability. She was arrested numerous times for these activities, but never stopped. Stephanie St. Clair died in 1969 at the age of 82. By then, Harlem had changed dramatically. The numbers racket had been largely replaced by state lotteries, and many of the men who had fought against her were long dead. But her legacy lived on in the stories told on Harlem's streets, in the memory of a woman who stood up to the most powerful criminals in America and refused to back down. The meeting where the room turned against Schultz became legend in underworld circles. It was whispered about in back rooms and speakeasies, a cautionary tale about underestimating your opponent, about the difference between fear and respect, about how true power comes not just from the ability to inflict violence, but from the ability to inspire loyalty and command respect. Stephanie St. Clair proved that muscle isn't just about how many guns you have or how many men you can put on the street. Real muscle, lasting muscle, comes from intelligence, from strategy, from understanding human nature and building something that people believe in. She showed that a woman with no army could defeat men with vast criminal empires, that respect earned is more powerful than fear imposed, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the most dangerous person in the room. They thought she had no muscle because they couldn't see beyond the surface, couldn't imagine that power might look different than they expected. But when that room of hardened criminals turned against Dutch Schultz and sided, however reluctantly, with Stephanie St. Clair, it proved what she had known all along. True strength doesn't announce itself with violence and threats. True strength builds slowly, earns loyalty, commands respect, and endures long after the loud and violent have destroyed themselves. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, Queenie of Harlem, proved that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates until it's far too late.